Recording has started. Okay. So I'm looking forward to this upcoming week. This is the week where we go over drugs. I think that this is an important topic to have a good discussion about. So we'll be using a lot of the time that we have allotted for today for me to introduce you to this chapter. What we'll be doing is we'll be going over different classifications of drugs. There is a video on stimulants, a video on depressants, and a video on hallucinogens. But prior to all of that, there's some good theory that currently exists for how drug dependence occurs. And I think it's going to be useful for all of you to have this knowledge. So a lot of today is going to be a bit of lecture, but there will be plenty of opportunity for participation as well. And I would encourage you to do so. Before we get to that, though, the segue from last week where we talked about sleep. Can anyone explain to me this question, or answer this question? Why is sleep included in a chapter on consciousness? You should be able to make this connection or explain this. Why is sleep in a chapter on consciousness? How does sleep affect your consciousness? Is everyone super sleepy this morning? Is everyone still recovering from the weekend? Is that what's happening? At least tell me, communicate so that I know. How's everyone feeling? Oof. All right. I won't pull any teeth then. I will appreciate your participation. It makes this far better, but I understand. Many of you are those of you who come here every week, so I certainly can't hold a grudge against you. Sleep is in this chapter because sleep is something that alters your consciousness, and that is what we're going to talk about. That's what we talked about with sleep, and that's what we're going to talk about with drugs, is how does your consciousness, that is your experience of all mental activity, of everything within your nervous system at any given moment, how is that altered? In what context? In what situation does it become altered? So sleep is altering your consciousness. As you descend down from wakefulness into N1 and N2 and N3 sleep, there are aspects of your body, of your nervous system, that are changing. Your heart rate slows, your brain waves start to slow down, become more elongated. And so those differences are going to alter your experience of the mental activity that's occurring within your nervous system. So I think a lot of people think that when you're asleep, you no longer have consciousness. That's not true. You are still conscious. You are just not conscious of the same things or in the same way, right? If you are asleep and I kick you, there is a possibility that you'll stay asleep, especially if you're in deep, deep sleep, but you're going to still be responsive to that kick. Either your brain is going to say, something is harming you right now, or in the often weird scenario, you might be having a dream, and if someone kicks you, you now in the dream feel like someone is kicking you, right? So you're still conscious, you're still aware of things around you. The difference is the activity within your nervous system and in your brain is different. Therefore, it's a different kind of consciousness. It is an altered state of consciousness. Last week, it's all out of order. Last week, I presented this to you, that your brain is something that interprets information to enhance your own survival. That is, okay. Thank you, Haley. I appreciate that. Hey, Charity. Your brain is something that interprets information to enhance survival. So your brain is, as much as your heart is an organ, as much as your skin is an organ, that your bones are an organ system, you have your brain. As much as those things help you to survive, your brain also helps you to survive. And so it's there to recognize patterns. But when you're recognizing those patterns, your perception does not always have to match reality. That's the argument I made last time. Well, here I want to give you an example of that using the information that we learned this past week. Your dreams are an example of something that your brain does that is adaptive. It aids in your survival. It helps you. But in the process, your perception is not matching reality. So what we learned is that your brain, when you dream, what that is your brain interpreting interpreting signals that are sent from your brainstem, right? So up from your brainstem, you shoot out these electrical impulses into the cortex, into the rest of the brain, and so your brain is going to do what it is meant to do. It's going to try to interpret those signals. But those signals are fairly random. They're just created by your brainstem. They're not created by stimulation from the outside world. So why does it do this? Remember that it strengthens synaptic connections. When you fall asleep and you have a good night's sleep, it helps with memory consolidation. It helps you to remember things. If memory is stimulating those connections through long-term potentiation, and when you are asleep and you send those signals up, your brain is kind of automatically stimulating the connections that you have built throughout the day. This is how sleep aids you. This is how dreaming aids you. It helps you to survive. It actually helps improve your memory of what happened to you that day. But as a consequence of that strengthening of memories, it causes you to hallucinate. When you dream, you are seeing something that is not actually there. So your perception of what's happening to you, as I've had some weird dreams where I'm like a dolphin swimming through an ocean, and then a fire dog, a dog that's like on fire, comes out and like burns me. That's not really happened. That's a really weird perception. There's no reality where that's happening, but I perceive it. So my perception of what I'm experiencing is not matched to reality. But it still helps me because those random electrical signals that are creating the dream are helping to strengthen my memories that I've built throughout the day. Okay. Does that make sense? This is as an example of how your brain, something that your brain does, helps you, even though your perception may not match reality of what's actually happening. That stand out as a good example to anyone, or okay. Thank you for that. All right. Of course, one of the things that I also noted is that when you're dreaming, your brain actually inhibits your voluntary muscles, so you can't move. This is actually something that aids you too. It helps in your survival. Your body knows that when you're dreaming, you could actually start acting out those dreams, right? Because you're interpreting these signals that are being created by your brainstem. So to keep you from injuring yourself, you inhibit your muscles so that you don't move. So you can safely hallucinate without damaging yourself. All right, that's an example of that concept that we went over last week. And I think it's an important one to realize that your perception does not have to match reality. Therefore, you should be building up as many examples of this as you possibly can. Good to have. All right, questions about sleep before we move on to drugs. Any questions about sleep? There were some things I did not go over, like sleep disorders. We can talk about the causes of insomnia or sleep apnea, which a lot of people, especially in the United States, suffer from. Anything? Any questions about sleep? Things that you want to know? I'm going to throw this out here as a piece of advice. It's something that I realized I did not put in the videos. But the idea that your sleep cycle is regulated by light is very, very important for knowing how to get a good night's sleep. There are a lot of people who work swing shifts, who work really, really late, and then they sleep during the day. If you are one of those people and you habitually have a terrible night's sleep where your sleep is very poor quality, one of the things that may be causing that is that often, especially here, it's very bright here and it gets bright early in the morning. If you are trying to sleep and there is light coming through the windows, even if it's blocked a little bit by curtains, it can mess with your sleep cycle. So if you have trouble sleeping and you have to sleep during the day, I recommend one of two things. Either, and this is a good one, you could do both too, it really helps. Either get blackout curtains. You can go on Amazon, you can look these up, they're called blackout curtains. These are curtains that are specifically designed to block out light. It makes it very, very dark in a room. That will keep those signals from accidentally telling you to wake up when you should be asleep. The other thing is you should get a sleep mask, like a good quality sleep mask that blocks out light. There's some pretty cheap, decent ones, again, on Amazon, wherever you want to get them. But those help a lot. I use a sleep mask often. When I lived up in Michigan, it was very, very cloudy all the time. And so a lot of the time there was no sun, which contributes a little bit to depression, had its own drawbacks. But I didn't have to worry about it as much. It's very sunny. It's beautiful here. And so I've had to adapt a little bit. I've had to put a sleep mask on and get more blackout curtains. I highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. Okay. Well, then let's talk about what everyone wants to talk about. Let's talk about drugs. I'm going to refer to them as psychoactive drugs. There are many different types of drugs. We are specifically going to focus on the ones that cause rather drastic changes in your perception, drastic changes in how your nervous system operates. Something like Tylenol, just a pain reliever, a very mild painkiller. It is a drug. Painkillers alter your perception of something, but I'm going to focus on really the ones that cause extreme differences, like amphetamines, which are a stimulant, or another type of painkiller would be heroin. Heroin, its basic action is it inhibits pain, but it does a substantially better job of doing it, almost harmful amount of doing it. And so I'm talking about we're going to talk mostly about the more extreme versions of drugs, but a lot of the ideas that we'll review today and in lecture this week apply to the more mild stuff too. So if we're going to talk about drugs, and maybe we'll have a bit of discussion as time goes on, I want to make this disclaimer. Drugs as a topic, drug use as a topic, is very, very complex. What I'm going to focus on in this class is simply how do drugs affect your nervous system, and therefore, what will your experience be like if you do one of these drugs? However, there is a very important kind of socio-historical context to using drugs. That is, there are very real social consequences to people using and especially abusing drugs. There is an entire set of social policies and laws related to what kinds of drugs we can use and which ones we can't. Drug use is a topic that is much bigger than this class could possibly cover. We could have an entire semester on drugs, and possibly two. So we are really taking a sliver of the conversation, a really thin slice of the conversation that we could have about drugs. And we're specifically going to look at how they're, what influence they have on a person's nervous system. If we're talking about this, and if someone has, so as we're talking about drug use, I actually encourage you, if you want to, if you have the courage to, if you know someone who has had an experience with drug abuse or drug addiction or dependency, I actually encourage you to share that information if you want. However, I realize that drug use is highly stigmatized. People judge people who use drugs, specific types of drugs. And so I want you to be aware of that in yourself. and be sensitive to other people's experiences. What we know about drug use is that, or drug addiction specifically, is that if someone is having a problem with drug abuse, the best therapy, the best intervention is usually to make them feel like they are part of a community still, that people still care about them, that they will not be exclusively judged by their drug use. There's a very instinctual, I think, gut reaction to if someone is addicted to heroin, if someone is, spun all the time, then there's kind of this tendency to kind of like push them away or to view them differently or to keep a safe distance. In some cases, that can be useful because people who abuse drugs will often be willing to do certain things to continue to get access to that drug. And so they might do shitty things to other people. But if you want someone to get over that, they need to feel part of a community in some way. So I actually recommend that you do not stigmatize drug use. You do not assume that using a drug is going to makes you a bad person. It's usually the circumstances that drive someone to abuse a drug in the first place that are usually driving them to do bad things. It's not necessarily the drug itself. So if you want to share these experiences about yourself or about someone you know, everyone else, please be respectful of that. That is the best thing you can do for anybody. Okay? So the goal of today's discussion is we're going to understand how drugs work using the terminology that we've learned in class. And surprise, surprise, we are going to be talking about long-term potentiation again. If you're tired of it, here's where it all pays off. This is actually, I think, one of the big reasons why I began teaching about long-term potentiation is because it's very useful for understanding how drug dependency, physical dependency specifically, occurs. But we'll also use some other terminology as well. So let's define them. What are psychoactive drugs? How would you define a drug, given what you know about drugs and what you know about how your nervous system works now? How would you define a drug? I want to take a shot at that. What does a drug do? Or what is it and what does it do? Yeah, Adriana.
Does it change the way that your nervous system functions?
Exactly. Right. It changes how your nervous system functions, and specifically, it's a chemical that does that. So the way that you produce memories, the way that you learn, the way that you experience the world around you and take in sensations and turn those sensations into perceptions, all of that stuff is being affected. We're talking about an altering consciousness. But how we're doing it is we're actually introducing a physical chemical substance. There are plenty of ways to change your consciousness. Drugs just happen to be one of the ways in which we can kind of do it involuntarily. You give someone a drug, you're going to be altering their consciousness in some way because you're actually changing the chemicals. So drugs induce an altered state of consciousness. Thank you for that, by the way. I appreciate the participation. So what does that mean? We already know what that means. You're altering something about your experience of the mental activity of your nervous system. Okay, well, let's think about this. Using this definition, how do painkillers alter consciousness? So if you take Tylenol, what changes about your consciousness? Or Advil, or aspirin, anything like that. And you don't have to raise your hand. You can just open the mic and start talking. I think you're assuming this might be a really obvious answer. Oh, it stops you from feeling pain, but it's bigger than that. Imagine you have a headache. What's different if you take a painkiller for that headache versus you don't take a painkiller for that headache? Sure, you stop feeling pain, but how else is your experience changing? For example, if you go to work with a headache, how are you going to be behaving? How are you going to interpret people's actions when you have a headache versus when you don't have a headache?
If you take painkillers during a headache, you're like probably less likely to be agitated than if you weren't to take one.
Perfect. Yeah. I mean, I think that's very good, because I think that we're not just talking about what the drug physically does to you. It's really about how is that going to change how you interact with other people? And you're right. If you have a headache, you're going to be more irritable. You're going to have less patience with people, right? You're going to be, okay, you know what? I just can't deal with you right now. You may be, feel a little more pissy with a customer or whatnot, or with your coworkers. Versus if you don't have a headache, that changes how you interpret people's behavior. It changes how you interact with them. That's really what we're talking about here. Not just what does the drug do, but what are the consequences of changing that? Okay, how does caffeine alter consciousness? What does caffeine do to you? I had to put that into words. I am hopped up on caffeine right now. This is my second cup of tea. What does caffeine do to your consciousness?
So caffeine makes you stay like more aware. So if you were to be traveling like 5 hours, 6 hours to go back home and you start getting tired, most people will stop and get like a coffee or something to boost their energy.
Okay, good. So a few things in there. You're more aware, usually. So if something's happening around you, if you're relatively sleepier, you are kind of tuned out, right? If you're sleepy right now, which you may be, it's the weekend after Halloween, you may have had party plans. Now you're recovering, you might be sleepy. So you are possibly zoning out more for this lecture. So if you take caffeine, the intent is I'm going to be aware, I'm going to be alert. And you're right, it at least seems to give you more energy. I'm going to make this point in the recorded lectures, but a lot of people think that when you take caffeine, you are actually receiving energy. Something about the caffeine gives you energy. What's actually happening, though, is caffeine increases the rate at which stored energy, so things like sugar and glucose, for those of you who are bio people, glucose and fats and proteins and the things that power your muscles, power the rest of your body, it increases the rate at which that stored energy gets used. So what caffeine does for you, what energy drinks do for you, the energy drink doesn't really give you energy, although a lot of them are sugary, so they kind of do. What they do is they increase the rate at which you use your stored energy. And this is why when you take caffeine, you can have a crash. It's because you use up that stored energy and then you don't have a lot of it left. So you end up having that crash feeling. Okay, so more alert, more awake, use up stored energy more quickly. Okay, those of you who have had the experience, I believe some of you at least may not legally be able to say you have, but how does alcohol alter consciousness? Even if you can't, feel free to talk about it. I'm not gonna judge anybody. How does alcohol alter consciousness? This one might be harder. How do people tend to act when they are drunk or when they're tipsy? They don't have to be drunk. We know that people drink it when you go out socializing, when you're partying. Why is alcohol so popular at parties, do you think? Or in social situations?
Because it tends to make you like have more fun, probably.
It can often. How so? What do you? It does make it seems to get people to do fun things more.
For like an example, because I probably feel like everybody right now in the class is probably drunk, but it makes you I don't know, like so at parties it gets you more like hyped up.
It's funny because alcohol is actually depressant. In terms of categorization, it's a depressant. So caffeine will get you hyped up. Alcohol does seem to have a weird effect though, where it's a depressant. It actually slows the activity of some aspects of your nervous system, but people feel more open to do things. They feel more what's called disinhibited, right? So if you're at a party and you drink alcohol, you're probably more likely to go out and dance if there's dancing going on. You're more likely to approach someone that you find attractive and flirt with them and whatnot. You're more likely to just generally, you're more willing to make a fool of yourself, right? In the sake of having fun. Well, what alcohol does is it's actually, so first off, it's a full body depressant. I'll say that. So it has many, many different effects. But the thing that I think people rely on alcohol for is it actually shuts down certain aspects of the prefrontal cortex within the frontal lobe. And if you remember, the frontal cortex, the frontal lobe, is responsible for decision making and inhibiting your behavior. So if you want to do something that's kind of impulsive or kind of fun, you might stop yourself from doing that. So you want to dance, right? You want to go out, you want to dance, and you have that little voice within your head saying, okay, I do want to go out and dance. However, I might make a fool of myself. I might be laughed at, and then my reputation is going to be damaged in some way because I went out and did something stupid. Well, when you're drunk or you're at least tipsy, you're going to be slightly more disinhibited from doing that. So if you have that impulse to go out and dance, you might throw caution to the wind and say, I don't care about my reputation. I don't care what other people think. I'm just going to go do it. That's what can get people to kind of let loose. That it seems like they're more stimulated. It seems like they're having more fun. They are technically being depressed. They are slowing down in some ways. You're slowing down the part of your brain that is responsible for inhibiting yourself. You're more likely to do these impulsive things. This is why alcohol can have a lot of different effects on people. Some people get really angry, they get aggressive, right? When you're drinking, someone might be more likely to act violently or to fight people. You might have an impulse to fight someone who insults you. Normally, if someone insults you and you want to fight them, you might go, you know what? You're really pissing me off right now, but I'm not going to strike you because I know better. However, if you're disinhibited, you might just act on that impulse, and now you are being aggressive, you are being violent. So alcohol in a lot of ways kind of reveals those impulses. Okay. Each of these drugs alters consciousness in some way. And to understand the action of drugs and to understand the different experiences that you can have while you're using a drug, I want to describe what dependency looks like. At some point, chances are, at some point in your life, you are likely to develop some kind of dependency. It may not be on a harder drug. It may not be on something like heroin. You may not start doing meth or et cetera, but a lot of people drink alcohol. And a lot of people at some point are going to start using caffeine in some way, however you prefer to get that. Or you might start smoking. These are all things that you can become physically dependent on. What that means is, after continued exposure to a drug, the body then has a more difficult time functioning normally without it. Here's the best way I think to understand this. You are a delicate balance of chemicals. Your nervous system, as it's releasing neurotransmitters, there is a certain amount of those neurotransmitters that are going to be released if, say, you are out at a party and you're dancing, or you're playing a video game and you find that video game really exciting, and so there's this kind of the concentration of neurotransmitters within your nervous system is going to affect your experience of doing those things. Well, if you take a drug, what you're doing is you might artificially introduce more neurotransmitters, more of those chemicals than would otherwise be there. And over time, if you continue to take a drug, your body will adjust and it'll say, you know what? I used to have to make my own dopamine. I used to have to make my own serotonin. Now I can rely on this external thing. Like this, my person, right? The person who for whom I'm a nervous system, but they keep drinking alcohol. They keep using meth. They keep drinking, coffee for caffeine. Now I can depend on the fact that that coffee is going to be there. I can depend that that alcohol is going to be there. So I don't have to work as hard. I can depend on the drug. Then when you stop taking the drug, your body kind of malfunctions and says, oh, geez, I don't have the caffeine that I used to have. So you feel even worse than before you were dependent on it. That's physical dependency. Your body expects a chemical to be there, and now it's not. Or well, it could be. It expects it to be there, but if you stop taking it, then it's not there anymore. So it has a harder time functioning without it. So let's use long-term potentiation to understand dependence. So again, this is long-term potentiation. I'm not going to beat this into you too much more. But on the left, that's before long-term potentiation. On the right, as you stimulate a connection more, the connection becomes stronger. And how it becomes stronger is you produce more neurotransmitters. So you release more of those neurotransmitters into the synapse, and you get more of these receptors that are accepting the neurotransmitters. Okay? We're all clear on that. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to use the abbreviation NT. That just means neurotransmitters. Okay? Okay, so this is where we start. Let's imagine that we have a connection, a synapse between two neurons that is responsible for the experience of pleasure. So at the very top, you see the neuron that is sending the action potential, that electrical charge that causes the release of the neurotransmitters. And then the next cell in line, let's say that that is responsible for your experience of pleasure. So unless this pathway gets stimulated, you won't feel as much pleasure. So that gets stimulated, there's some amount of neurotransmitter release. Let's introduce a drug to this system. Most drugs that will cause physical dependence actually do affect this pathway. This is called the dopamine reward system. So the neurotransmitter being released here is often dopamine. So dopamine is going to prime your body to expect pleasure. You take a drug, let's say it's alcohol, we could say it's meth, it's really, again, anything that's physically addictive. What this is going to do is, in one way or another, it's going to increase the amount of neurotransmitter that is within the synapse, that is within that space. Okay, if we're increasing the amount of neurotransmitter in this space, according to long-term potentiation, what will happen? If you are dumping more neurotransmitter into this space, physically what is going to happen to the next neuron, that neuron that's in charge of pleasure? This drug is stimulating the connection with more neurotransmitters. So the next cell in line is going to create more of what? What is that green neuron going to develop? With long-term potentiation, you're getting more neurotransmitters, and when you get more neurotransmitters, you then also get more of what?
Do you get more pleasure?
You will. So the experience, at least at this point, is you're going to feel more pleasure. But physically, what is going to change about that next neuron? What does long-term potentiation cause? That next neuron is going to create more receptors, right? Those little purple channels that accept the chemical, they're going to be producing more of those. If you have more neurotransmitters, that means that the next cell needs more receptors to accept all of them. So your neuron is going to say, oh my God, there's so many neurotransmitters here. I need to create more receptors to receive those neurotransmitters. So what's going to happen is, you can kind of see this, I added a few more receptors here on the bottom image. You can see that we create more receptors to accept more of those neurotransmitters. That's long-term potentiation. Now, let's say that we stop using the drug. When you stop using a drug, what happens is you're going to lose the neurotransmitters. You're not creating as many as you used to. You're going to keep the receptors. The receptors are already created. They're already there. So now you have tons and tons and tons of receptors, but you're only making as much of the neurotransmitter as you used to before you started taking that drug. What do you think that's going to do? I want to take a guess at that. If you have tons of receptors, but you don't have as many neurotransmitters as you used to. With those receptors, that neuron that's in charge of pleasure is now expecting there to be a huge amount of neurotransmitter. With more receptors, it's actually going to require that amount of neurotransmitter to activate the next cell, activate that pleasure pathway. So in this situation where we have more receptors and not enough neurotransmitters, the normal amount of neurotransmitter that you would make naturally will not be enough to stimulate that pleasure reward pathway. Quite literally, it will depend on that drug to create the same level of pleasure that you used to be able to create. That's physical dependence. Your neuron is prepared. It needs more of that neurotransmitter. So when you don't get as much, you don't stimulate that pathway. You may not feel as much pleasure. This is why if you become dependent on caffeine, we'll take a really mild example. If you become dependent on caffeine, and say in the morning you do not get your cup of coffee and you are exceptionally irritable, you just don't want to talk to anybody, it seems like you are incapable of feeling pleasure in that moment, that is quite true. You may need that level of caffeine to actually stimulate your ability to pay attention, your ability to stay awake, your ability to experience the pleasure that you would normally experience just kind of getting up in the morning and maybe talking to your kids or talking to your family or, texting, just communicating with your friends, whatever you happen to be doing. You will not experience as much pleasure in that situation. Same with alcohol. In a lot of cases, if you become physically dependent on alcohol, you can get to a situation where the things that used to bring you pleasure do not have that same level of pleasure anymore. You almost feel kind of numb to things that would normally make you happy because you're not able to stimulate that reward system, that pleasure system as much as you used to. Or at least you need the alcohol to do so. So this is the basis of physical dependence. You need more of the neurotransmitters to produce the same experience. When you are dependent, you need the neurotransmitters from that drug. So if you need more neurotransmitters, therefore you need more of the drug to produce the same experience. That's the basis of physical dependence. So what are the symptoms of physical dependence? Well, one, you're going to experience something called drug tolerance. So you require more of the drug to have the same experience. This is how you can get people who, I mean, you may, again, probably experience this yourself. The first time that you ever drank coffee, you probably felt really jittery. You may have felt like just on top of the world. It was a really good experience. Then, as time goes on and you drink coffee every morning, you realize that, well, now you need 2 cups of coffee to get the same experience that you had before. And then that becomes not enough, and so now you need 3 cups of coffee to recreate that experience. So this is how you can kind of get on that treadmill where you need more and more and more of a drug. Because what you're doing is you are chasing down that same experience. You want to feel the same way. You want to feel the way that you felt when you first started taking caffeine. Or you want to recreate that experience the first time of drinking alcohol. So you will eventually need to drink more of it to get that same experience. That's drug tolerance. And then withdrawal, you may have heard this term. This refers to any physical sensations that occur because the body is trying to adjust to the absence of the drug. That is that irritability. That's getting a headache. If you don't drink caffeine, you might get a headache because you're just not taking in enough. There are physical symptoms. This gets really severe when you talk about something like heroin. The action of heroin is it simulates the natural endorphins within your body that kill pain. So withdrawal of heroin usually looks like an incredible sensitivity to anything that could cause pain. So the withdrawal symptoms of heroin are usually excruciating pain. This is usually what drives people back. I mean, one, not feeling pain can really, really stimulate that pleasure reward system, so heroin can be a very pleasant experience. However, what can keep you coming back is if you don't take it, you're going to be suffering immensely. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the recorded lectures. I'll go into heroin a little bit and kind of why it has that effect and what people's experiences with it can be. That is an example of withdrawal. You need that drug to continue the same experience. All right. Here's some questions. I kind of just want to actually highlight 2 things. One, I want to note that the experience of becoming physically dependent can be understood if you remember what negative reinforcement is. So we're going back to the learning chapter. Does anyone remember what it means to negatively reinforce a behavior? What does that mean? What is negative reinforcement? It's reinforcement. So what do you remember about reinforcement? If you're being reinforced,
Basically it avoids like having a negative outcome.
yes, with the goal of doing what? So you're avoiding a negative outcome. You're avoiding something aversive or not pleasant, and therefore it causes what to happen? You're right. Reinforcement is we're increasing a behavior. We want some response to happen more often. So when you reinforce a rat to press a bar, you're trying to get that rat to press the bar more. So we're talking about increasing a behavior. And we're trying to increase that behavior by taking away something that's unpleasant. Okay. With withdrawal, what happens for a lot of people, how you get stuck, and there's a fine line between recreational drug use and physical dependence. And the fine line is usually at the point at which you take a drug because it feels good versus you're taking a drug to take away something that is aversive to you. When you first start taking a drug, usually the reason you're taking it is it's pleasant to do so. You are taking a drug because it gives you an experience that you really like. When you take that drug a lot, and then you develop a physical dependence on it, what can then happen is, because of these withdrawal symptoms, if you don't take that drug, you start getting these physical kind of negative sensations. At that point, you may be taking the drug not because it makes you feel good, but you take the drug to get rid of the withdrawal symptoms. You see this a lot with alcoholism, addiction to alcohol, where I knew someone, through someone else, I knew someone who his routine was, he was actually in construction, and his routine was before work, he would actually go into a gas station and pick up like a small bottle of whiskey. And the idea was, if he didn't do that, he would get these really intense tremors. They're called delirium tremens, and it's one of the withdrawal symptoms of severe alcohol addiction, where you can't really control your muscles. Well, if you're in construction, you need a little bit of dexterity. You need to be able to you need to know you're hitting what you want to hit. You're building what you want to build. And so he would take alcohol, not because he was looking to be drunk at work, but because he needed to drink that alcohol so that he wouldn't get those tremors. That would be an example of negative reinforcement. You continue a behavior not because it feels good, but because it takes away something bad. That is kind of the hallmark of dependency. If you find yourself doing something because it takes away withdrawal symptoms, that's when you got to be careful. That's when you got to be like, okay, hold on a second, I might have a dependency here. I need to look into that a little bit. The other thing that, how else we can apply this to what we've already learned is, one of the other things that we learned in the learning chapter is that you can create associations through associative learning. If you are dependent on a drug, and maybe you go to Alcoholics Anonymous, or you go to some kind of recovery program, one of the things that they'll teach you is that you should try to stay away from, or at least be careful in situations where, in places and around people where you used to use that drug. For example, if you used to hang out in your friend's basement doing meth, you're going to associate that basement with using meth. And so if you are in recovery and then you go hang out with that friend and you both are sitting in that basement, that is a prime opportunity to do something called relapsing, where you're trying not to use a drug and then you end up using it, because there's such a strong there's a strong push by your environment to say, this is where we do meth. Let's do meth right now. So be aware that this happens. You can associate outside things with a trigger. This is especially difficult for people who are trying to quit smoking, because the place where people smoke a lot is usually where they work, right? So you work a 9-to-5 job, you're stuck in one place for a long period of time, and maybe you're used to smoking there. You then try to quit smoking, but then you go back to work, and you're getting this constant pressure all the time of, oh my God, this is where I smoke. I usually take a smoke break at this time. So you have to fight extra hard to stop yourself from smoking. Be aware of that. Sometimes the best thing to do is to stay away from those situations that are potentially going to cause you to relapse. But sometimes that's you can't avoid it. In those moments, just be mindful of that. That it's not really under your control. Where your brain is telling you, this is where we do this. Let's do this now. I need this drug to continue to function. Just being mindful of the fact that your brain will do that against your own good judgment can often be helpful. Just be aware of that. Questions about physical dependence. being physically dependent on a drug. Well, beyond physical dependence, there is also something called psychological dependence. The difference between them, so first off, they can both be happening at the same time, but they can also be happening separately. Psychological dependence is less your body needs, like physically needs a drug, chemically needs a drug to keep working. And this is more of you actually hold a belief. This is something that you tell yourself. This is a story that you spin for yourself. It's a belief that a drug is needed to continue a feeling of emotional or psychological well-being. So that is, you habitually use a drug to achieve a desired experience because you believe that to even have an experience that's worth having, you need to be taking this drug to do so. Not all drugs are physically dependent, or sorry, not all drugs cause physical dependence. A category of drug that tends to either have no symptoms of physical dependence or very low symptoms of physical dependence are hallucinogens. Things like LSD. Marijuana is in that category as well. Marijuana can have some physically addictive properties, but the big thing that keeps people coming back is usually the psychological dependence, that they may believe that unless they are high while they're doing something, it's not really worth doing that thing. And so it's not really that your body it can't possibly function without marijuana, but it's more of, well, why not smoke it? Why not have this experience? This experience is so much better when I am high. So I needed to get that experience. Some possibly familiar sensations you may have had. You can hold the belief that being at a party will not be worth it unless I drink. So this is a situation, a lot of people, you may not be physically addicted to alcohol. You don't need it. However, especially I've seen this in a lot of people who have like social anxiety when they're around other people and they're really afraid of what other people think of them, so that they have a hard time letting loose. They might actually convince themselves, you know what, when I go to a party, unless I'm drinking at that party, I'm not going to be letting loose. I'm not going to be having a good time. And so kind of what's the point of going to a party unless I'm going to be drinking while I'm there? Otherwise, I'm just going to be a stick in the mud. It's not going to be very fun. That would be a psychological dependence. You have a belief. The reality is you could act that way. You could throw caution to the wind. You could not worry about what other people think of you. But alcohol makes it much easier to do that. So you develop the belief that you need alcohol to, or at least you would much prefer. If you, I think the good sign of that this is happening is if you're sitting at home and someone invites you out and you find out that it's going to be a dry party, and if it hadn't been a dry party, you could drink alcohol there, you would have gone. But because they told you it was a dry party, you then look at it and go, well, I could go to a dry party, or I could just kind of stick at home and watch Netflix and just do something else. And it was really the fact that you either could or could not drink that was determining whether you wanted to go to that party or not. That's the calling card of psychological dependence. Something that I think, especially a lot of guys, men are, I mean, this is changing to some degree, but men especially play a lot of video games, especially very immersive, kind of first-person shooters, things like Skyrim, where you get, or Red Dead Redemption, where you get invested in this really deep story. And so your enjoyment of that video game might be how immersed you get. One of the things that marijuana can do for you is it can give you that feeling of immersion. It usually intensifies a lot of sensations, and so getting lost in a video game can be a lot easier if you're high while you do it. That's fine. That's an experience you can have, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that inherently. If you get to a point where you say, I don't really feel like playing this video game, it's not really worth it unless I'm high while I play it, that is, again, the calling card of psychological dependence. And same with creativity. Being spun, so this is just a term to be kind of like the equivalent of tipsy or drunk, but on stimulants. So things like amphetamines and the like. A lot of people experience a burst of creativity when they are on a stimulant. And it's possible that if you use stimulants long enough that you feel like when you're not on stimulants, you're not creative. You don't write as well. You don't produce art as beautifully. You've lost that creativity somehow. You've not lost that creativity. You're just as creative. But you may have a belief that unless you're on a stimulant, you can't be creative. That would be psychological dependence. Again, these overlap a lot. You can be both physically and psychologically dependent, but there are situations where you're not physically dependent, your body doesn't need it, but you believe that you do. Okay. Does that distinction make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that distinction or where that line is between physical and psychological dependence? I want to introduce another really influential theory in the literature, in current scientific literature on drug dependence, and it's called the opponent process theory of drug addiction. I think this is really, really helpful for understanding how you can become both physically and psychologically dependent on a drug. And here's the basis of the argument. When you take a drug, you will experience two different processes. First, you experience something called process A, and this is the action of the drug. So if you are drinking caffeine, this is your feeling of stimulation, of being aware, of being like really hyped up. So usually process A is kind of that pleasant experience, the thing that you're looking for. There's then another process that's happening within your body, process B, which is when the body compensates for the drug's presence. Your body actually likes to be in a balanced state. That's something called homeostasis. Those of you who are into biology, who are into chemistry, there's something called homeostasis where you have a system, you want that system to be balanced. Your body at all times wants to be balanced because anything that's not homeostasis can very quickly lead to death and problems and stuff like that. So if you start taking a drug, your body is actually going to start producing chemicals that have the exact opposite effect of that drug. That's what process B is. So process B is when your body creates natural chemicals to counteract the action of the drug that you're taking. So process B often causes an effect opposite to the initial effect. And again, that is to help maintain homeostasis. What is a stable equilibrium? That is a stable kind of equalizing of what's happening within your body at any given time. So process A, then process B. This is a chart. It's very intimidating, but it does a very good job of explaining what your experience will be like as you become physically or psychologically dependent on a drug. And it uses this terminology of process A and process B to explain. So let me try and familiarize you with this chart a little bit. This is, if we're looking, x-axis and y-axis. Along the bottom, we have time. So we're measuring time on the bottom. And then on the y-axis along the side, it's labeled as the hedonic scale. There are two things here. There's your experienced state, and that's kind of your subjective perception. That is, if you take caffeine, you have that subjective experience of being hyped up. That's what's at the very top of that scale. And then there's another scale below that that's labeled opponent process. That is this is trying to measure what the process A and process B actually looks like in your body. Okay, so we're measuring process A, process B, and we're measuring that experience across time. Okay, what it's showing here is if we focus on the opponent process part of this first, when you start taking the drug, you see that there's a spike in activity where process A goes up. That is, you start taking caffeine, therefore you start feeling that level of stimulation. And this is assuming you've never had caffeine before, all right? It's another important detail. You're not taking caffeine before. You'll then see that that dotted line below it, that's process B. After a little bit, your body will recognize, hey, there's caffeine in here. It's actually causing me to be more hyped up than I otherwise should be. So what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start creating chemicals to counteract that caffeine. That's process B. So you can see that process B activates and starts to counteract the experience of process A. Then process A ends because the drug wears off. What you see is that there's still a little bit of the process B left over. It doesn't end as quickly as when the drug ends. Okay. So if you look above that at the experience that you're having, you can see if you track the experience, at first you take caffeine and you have that A state. You feel hyped up. Then as the B process begins, you start to feel less hyped up. It kind of decreases a little bit. Then as time goes on, the drug wears off and the B process actually becomes dominant, where there's a drop off very suddenly and it actually dips below your kind of resting state. Now you're actually experiencing the opposite of what caffeine does. At that point where it's kind of labeled B state, where you are below the line and you've dipped a bit, that would be the experience of crashing. That would be the experience of feeling really tired after you drank some caffeine, after you ingested some caffeine. So you start out initially having the A state, the B process kind of helps de-intensify it, it makes it less intense. Then when the drug wears off, the B process actually kind of pulls you really far down and makes you tired. And then eventually you go back to normal state. Okay. Everything I just described is what your experience will be, or would be, if you were not dependent on a drug. You have that A state, B state then starts. You then kind of have this mild hangover, this kind of crash, and then you kind of go along your way. All right. If we move to the right, this is describing after addiction, after dependence. Over time, what your body learns is it can expect caffeine to be there. So rather than you drinking a cup of coffee and then there's a little bit of a delay and then the B process starts, your body has actually learned, okay, when I start drinking coffee, immediately start the B process. Immediately start creating those chemicals that are going to counteract the caffeine. So you can see there's kind of an uptick in the A process, and at the same time there's a downtick, there's a downbeat in the B process. If you look up at what that experience looks like, it's very different from when you first initially started taking that drug. You do get, if you look at the very top, you do get that little blip in experience. So you kind of get a little bit of a rush. You get a little bit of that caffeine effect. But then the B process is so powerful that it completely counteracts the effect of the caffeine. You don't get that spike in a focus anymore. Then when the drug wears out, the B process, because it's been trained to be so intense, that B process now brings you really low. You can see that in the right side chart, in the right side part of the chart, the B process actually goes much lower after the drug wears off when you're addicted versus when you're not. This is why this is withdrawal, right? That really low dip in the B process, that is withdrawal. Your body wants this because the B process is so strong. Okay. Understand that was a lot. Take this away from it. You have an A process, it spikes when you first start taking a drug. You have a B process that counteracts it. As you become dependent on a drug, the B process kicks in more quickly and it becomes more intense and it lasts longer. Which means that state you're looking for, being pepped up by caffeine, you're not going to experience it as intensely. And in fact, you're going to have an even worse crash than when you first started taking the drug. That's the opponent process theory of addiction. Let me give you a few solid examples, some experiences you've probably had of the opponent process theory. If you drink caffeine, what you first experience is that stimulation, that's process A. Then you experience the crash, that's process B. I've already explained that to some degree. I won't belabor that more, but let's talk about alcohol. With alcohol, the first experience you have is this depressant, calming, dulling property, right? When you drink, they might get a little bit kind of hazier, you feel more disinhibited, you're not really paying attention to as much, you're not obsessively thinking about things. That's the process A, that dulled sensation. Well, if your body then wants to counteract that, it's going to start producing chemicals within your body that produce the process B, which is restlessness. As you can't really sit still, you kind of feel like, this is like when you've been drinking and then the next morning you feel kind of like, you feel restless, like your body wants to move, but you're also tired because you're spent. That's restlessness. And then you also have sensitivity. If being drunk or being tipsy makes you less aware of some of the things that are happening around you, the next morning, as you are hungover, you might have sensitivity to light and sound and other things, right? So light kind of gets more intense. You kind of don't want to look out the window. I don't want to go outside right now. Or no, please keep it down. It's just too sensitive right now. What you're doing is you're dealing with the B process. You're dealing with that counteracting set of chemicals within your body at the moment. This, I don't know if anyone's experienced this, but if you drink heavily, this is not so much the case when you drink lightly, but if you drink heavily the night before, you may have noticed that when you go to bed, sometimes you wake up earlier than you otherwise would have. So sometimes if I'm drinking, you go to bed at like 1 or 2 a.m. and then wake up at 6 or 7, you've only gotten 4 hours of sleep. You wake up at 6 o'clock feeling like, geez, I'm kind of awake now. What's happening is you're being woken up by the B process. You're being woken up by those counteracting chemicals that stimulate you. You have a hard time getting back to sleep. Then what happens is you might be up for a little while, that B process wears off, and then you get tired by like noon. So you want to go take a nap then. It's the B process that causes the feeling of being hungover, the feeling of being restless. So we can talk about this with any drug. There's an A process for heroin. The A process is you don't feel pain and it's fairly pleasurable. The B process is you can feel excruciating pain. You have a sensitivity to pain. So the B process kind of keeps you addicted. You want to get rid of it. So what you do is you take more of the drug, you take more heroin to get rid of that sensitivity to pain, that B process. This is what makes drug dependence such a kind of dangerous thing. It's a cycle, right? You are constantly trying to escape the B process by taking more of the drug. That's the opponent process theory. Questions about that theory? I threw a lot at you, but I think it's a very valuable way to view drug addiction. Does this explain any of your own experiences? I mean, we can talk about alcohol, we can talk about caffeine, but we could really talk about kind of any situation where this happens. Does this help explain any experience you've had after taking some kind of drug? We'll talk about marijuana in a little bit more detail as we go into the lectures. But one of the things that marijuana does is it makes you, it mildly intensifies certain sensations. So that is, colors will seem a little bit more vibrant. Music sounds deeper and almost like there might be a greater majesty to the music that you're listening to. Well, the A process is all that stuff is almost more pleasant. It's kind of like enjoyable. You can get lost in certain things more easily. The B process, although there doesn't huge hangover, I got disconnected. Although there doesn't seem to be a huge hangover to smoking. One of the things that people report over time, if you use marijuana regularly, is that it can kind of be harder to get lost in things unless you're high. There was actually there's a book that I want to recommend to everyone. This is written by a professor called, her name is Judith Grisel. I actually met Judith. I got my master's program in the department where she currently works. And she actually, in this book, what she does is she introduces the science of addiction, but also does it by presenting some of her own experiences, because she was for a very long time addicted to many different types of drugs. So it's a very good book. I highly recommend it. One of the examples she gave was her one friend who consistently kind of smoked weed would actually prefer to get high and then hang out with her kids, because it's easier when you're high to get lost in kids' mindset. So children, when they're interacting with the world, everything's fascinating, right? You just want to focus on this and focus on that and get lost in something. And he found it easier to bond with his children while he was high because he was kind of in the same mindset. What he then realized, though, was after a while, he didn't really want to hang out with his kids unless he was high while he did it. So at a certain point, he got to the point where he said, well, you know what? It's not really worth hanging out with my kids unless I'm high. That's psychological dependence, right? It sounds terrible, but it's actually entirely, it's logical. It's understandable that if that's what weed does, it makes you kind of get lost in these things. And that's what children do. They get lost in things. That you'd find the advantage of smoking and then hang out with your kids. Just something to be aware of. There is that B process where you're smoking for so long, you can start to lose interest in some of the things that would normally interest you, because you can't dive as deeply into them. You don't feel like you can kind of get lost in them as easily. I think that's one of the consequences of weed that we don't entirely understand. I'll present a bit of research on marijuana, what we know about it in the lectures, but there's a lot that we don't know. I'll leave it at that. So this week, we're going to go over the different types of drugs, stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens. I'll give you probably more information than you want. And again, my intent is not to tell you whether you should or should not do a drug, but rather, if you decide to do this, here's what you should expect. And there are some drugs that have much more harmful consequences, especially with abuse, than others. And I will clearly label when that happens to be the case. For example, I highly recommend everyone stays away from heroin. That's a pretty no-brainer. We'll get into that. Any questions about drug use, etc.? Anything that we've covered today? All right. Well, if you haven't, I recommend taking a screenshot of this book. If you want to learn more about this, this is an easy read. This is written by a PhD, but it is written for a general audience. And so I found it extremely easy and enjoyable to read. It's a good primer for those who want to know more about the current state of science of addiction. All right. Thank you very much. Of course, I will grade your hypotheses ASAP. And yeah, what's up, Adriana?
Me and Justinia were wondering what we need to bring to our labs on Thursday.
Oh, just yourselves. You don't have to bring anything. You're gonna arrive there, and it'll take like 10-15 minutes, I believe she told me, and then you're released. And I think what she's doing is she's recording a list of people who participated, and then she'll send me that list at the end of the semester. So you just gotta show. You just gotta show up.
Thank you so much.
Yep. All right. Yes, please do remember research participation if you've not signed up. And thank you all for being here. I will see you next week.